Okay, so let's talk about pre and post-zygotic barriers. So when we talk about reproduction and basically what defines a species, right? A species is when two individuals can mate and produce viable fertile offspring. So what we are looking at in this video are reasons why that wouldn't happen. Like, what are some reasons why two individuals could not have viable fertile offspring born or develop, right? So we have two ways that we can actually prevent this from happening. One is before the zygote is even formed. So what are some mechanisms or reasons why a sperm may never fertilize an egg, and therefore these two groups are reproductively isolated? Like, why would they never be able to become like a hybrid or merge as a species? Right? So we call these things prezygotic barriers. These are the reasons why a zygote would never form between two individuals, therefore keeping them as two separate species. Because remember, in order to be the same species, you would have to produce viable, fertile offspring. And if you never get a zygote, how will you have offspring together? So some examples of prezygotic barriers we're going to talk about. We have geographic isolation, habitat, behavioral, temporal, mechanical, and gametic isolation are all of the reasons why a zygote will not form between two individuals, therefore keeping them reproductively isolated and two separate species. But basically a prezygotic barrier is anything that prevents mating and fertilization. Now, sometimes mating does happen, though, between two different species. Now, what would prevent them from actually hybridizing and becoming one species? For example, like a horse and a donkey can mate and produce a mule, but how come you don't have a blending of horses and donkeys becoming like the same species, right? We call these reasons post-zygotic barriers. And therefore, mating does occur, but there's some reason why the offspring is not viable or fertile, and therefore you don't have a blending of these two populations or species coming together. So here we go. So the three there that we'll talk about are reduced hybrid fertility, reduced hybrid viability, and hybrid breakdown. So we're going to start with prezygotic barriers. And so really, how do these barriers show up, right? Like, how does speciation even happen? Well, first, populations will become isolated, whether that's geographically or reproductively, depends on the scenario. But once they're isolated from each other, then they're going to evolve independently. And then once they have their own independent evolution happening, natural selection, genetic drift, random mutations, etc. Well, if they come back in contact and they no longer choose to mate, well, then they're considered to be separate species. However, if they do mate, well, then speciation did not occur. So let's go ahead and talk about the six sorry, my doorbell just rang. Talk about the six prezygotic barriers. So first here we have geographic isolation. So here we have a population of lizards. Now let's pretend humans 100 years ago or something dammed up a river, and then they decide to remove the dam. So all of a sudden we have this river form that separates the population into two groups. Now, these lizards are not swimming lizards, and they no longer have gene flow between the two groups. So at this point, they are reproductively isolated. There is no mixing of their genes. So any mutations, for example, that show up on the left side are not also going to be in the gene pool on the right. They will stay only in the gene pool on the left. So there is no gene flow. So at this point, these two populations are reproductively isolated. Now, this sets the stage for speciation. Once you have two populations no longer mating, now given enough time, they're going to undergo their own evolution, right? Evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population. So each population will be subject to their own natural selection. Genetic drift are random changes that happen. There's sexual selection as well as different mutations. Now, the rate of mutation is not going to change in the two groups. A rate of mutation is pretty constant in nature. I mean, pretty predictable. But which or what mutations happen can be different. And if they have different mutations, then there's going to be different natural selection or different like high fitness or low fitness, like how will those mutations help the species survive? There'll be different variations. Sorry, that's what I was going for. So there's different selective environment or different selective pressures in the different environments, etc. So if these lizards stay separated for enough time, and if that river dries up and they come back in contact and then they mate, well, then speciation did not occur. But if they no longer recognize each other as the same species, now they are considered to be two separate species. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the example of the finches. So when finches arrived on the Galapagos Islands about 500,000 years ago, each island has a different ecosystem. And so there's different selective pressures. There's different food, there's different elevations, there's different rainfall. And so therefore, each like founding population, ooh, this ties into genetic drift with the founder effect. So here, each like finch that lands on a different island is under different selective pressures, and different mutations show up, different behaviors begin to emerge. And so they start singing different songs to like attract their mates, etc. And over the course of time, you have actually, truthfully, about 13 different species of finch have evolved. So I actually went to the Galapagos in 2018, and so here I took these pictures of some different finch species. So you can see how the cactus finch there on that cactus flower has a pointed beak for eating from the flowers on a cactus, versus this black finch here has a very large beak for cracking large seeds. So these finch have evolved to become different species due to different selective pressures on the different islands. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about habitat isolation. So here we might have the same like area, but if a species, like two populations live in different areas or different habitats, it just might be unlikely for them to mate together. For example, if I have these two populations of flies, now could they together make viable fertile offspring? Probably. But if one group lives in water, like the edges of like a river that's kind of stagnant, like they may live there and reproduce there and eat the algae that grows there and lay their larvae in the water. And then you have a nearby population that lives more in the soil and in the ground. Well, they live in different habitats. So are they really going to mate? No, they're going to probably most likely choose to mate with members that are nearby in their own habitats. And so by living in different habitats, this also prevents gene flow, which leads to reproductive isolation. And if two groups are reproductively isolated, that means they're not mating, and therefore, can they be the same species, right? And so habitat isolation, just kidding. So then as they become separated, you have in the water and on the land, they have their own selective forces, and over time, they may evolve to become two separate species. Now, we also see this in like lions and tigers. So they both live in India. However, the lion lives in grasslands while the tiger lives in forests. So their habitats are different, but could they produce like viable fertile offspring? Yeah, it's actually called a liger or a tigon, depending on who the mother is. And they have been formed in like circuses and stuff, like where the two animals are put together artificially, like by humans. So they can produce offspring together, but in nature, they wouldn't, because their habitats do not overlap. And so therefore, they remain reproductively isolated. Okay, so, this is probably my favorite, is behavioral isolation. You can see this very easily with birds, for example. And so, like this picture here, this is a song sparrow. You can tell by the little black spot on its chest. So song sparrows have a beautiful sound. This is a picture from Southern California. And so song sparrows will have their mating calls to attract their mates. Or you can see the grebes over here on the left. They have they actually will run on water like a little dance to like marry. And so there's different behavioral traits that organisms use to attract their mates. And so if two groups have different courtship rituals or mating rituals, well, therefore, that would prevent them from mating and keep them reproductively isolated. So a fun YouTube video you can search for is like Birds of Paradise from Planet Earth. It has lots of beautiful birds showing different dances to attract their mates. Anytime you go outside and you hear birds singing, they're singing for a mate. And so there's even some frogs who have evolved to only hear the croaking or the ribbiting of their own species. They only hear that frequency. If you've ever been to I've been to a rainforest. I've been to a rainforest a few times, Costa Rica, Belize, uh, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador. And so when you go into a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, the sound of insects and birds and organisms is almost overwhelming. It appears to be very difficult to hear your own species, and so therefore there are some frogs that only hear the frequency of their own species, and therefore they wouldn't even be able to mate with a different species. And so by having different courtship rituals, that leads them to staying or becoming reproductively isolated. You also see this in Happy Feet. If you've ever watched the movie Happy Feet, you have the penguins. One has the heart songs to attract mates, and the other ones build nests out of pebbles. And so, therefore, they would not mate together because they have different ways of attracting their partner. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about temporal isolation. So this is also really beautiful. So if two groups mate at different times of day, different times of year, like different seasons, or even different years, like the 17-year cicada. So if they mate at different times, well, then how will they ever make a zygote, right? So here we have the Fowler's toad and the American toad. One mates in early summer and one mates in late summer. So therefore, they're not mating at the same season. So therefore, they will never breed together. And that keeps them reproductively isolated as two separate species. Now, this is pretty important, though, in flowers, especially flowering plants that rely on wind for pollination or use like a common pollinator. So if a flower, like pollen is plant sperm. So if a plant flowers in January, for example, let's say it's a wintertime flower and it has its petals and stuff to attract pollinators. Now, a different flower like has its petals come out in May. Well, the sperm from the January flower isn't going to fertilize the Mayflower, because it's two different seasons, right? So that's also a way that would prevent two flowers from like hybridizing. Okay. And then we have gametic isolation. So this is important also for like wind pollinated plants or animals that live in water, for example. So for a water example, here we have some sea urchins. So red and purple sea urchins actually will release their gametes, their sperm and egg, into the current or into their environment, the water. And then the water will mix the gametes. Well, there's some kind of like chemical barrier on the egg that, like, let's take the red sea urchin. The eggs released into the water will not allow purple sea urchin sperm to enter. So there's like a chemical barrier that will only recognize its own species sperm to fertilize and form a zygote. So that would be gametic isolation, and pretty important in water or like wind pollinated species, where you'd have like random mating. And then we have our last prezygotic barrier is called mechanical isolation. And in mechanical isolation, it's basically based on the idea that physical differences will prevent two species from mating. So that could be in the animal kingdom, like a giraffe and a pig or something. Like obviously mechanically, physically, they can't mate. So they'd be two separate species. But if you look at like flowers, for example, you can see the foxglove and the trumpet creeper flower here. They both have like co-evolved with their pollinators. So the purple flower here is a very sturdy flower that allows like a kind of heavier bee to land and then go in and get nectar and then pick up the pollen to then transfer to another foxglove flower. Versus in the orange trumpet flowers, that the long flower, it's perfect for the hummingbird beak. And so therefore, the hummingbird never lands. So that orange trumpet flower could not hold the weight of a honeybee. And so therefore, the pollen from the purple flower will never make its way into to meet like the eggs in the orange flower. And so that would be due to mechanical differences or differences in their shape. Okay, so that kind of summarizes our five or six prezygotic barriers. So now, as we talk about this, though, this prezygotic barriers do lead to speciation, but we have two kinds of speciation. We have sympatric and allopatric. So let's see where I can put my face. I don't know. Let's see if I can make my face smaller. Nope. Okay. So here, when we talk, we'll just talk about allopatric first. So in allopatric speciation, basically, if a population gets separated and then evolves to become two separate species while being geographically separated, that is called allopatric speciation. So they were not near each other when they evolved to become different species. So that is due to like geographic isolation. Um, and even like while the group is separated, so let's take the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So the finches on different islands evolve different behaviors to attract mates and different like songs to like courtship rituals. Well, technically, if they came back together, they probably could still make viable fertile offspring, but now these different behaviors have evolved, and now the behavior differences keep them as two separate species. But those behaviors evolved while they were separated, so we call that allopatric speciation. Now, sympatric speciation, though, is when these prezygotic barriers occur while living in the same area. So we can use the behavioral ones again. In behavioral isolation, you could have like birds that live near the bottom of the tree or the forest floor could have different dances to attract their mates, where birds at the top of the tree could have different dances to attract their mates. And therefore, the different behaviors would keep them reproductively isolated. Again, watch the Birds of Paradise video on YouTube. So sympatric speciation can also happen. So like our lizard example from earlier would be allopatric speciation. And then if we look at sympatric speciation, sympatric speciation, like if these fish, these cichlid fish, were like one species, and then one group like ate insects that landed on the surface, but then another group kind of ate from the bottom. Eventually, over time, their gametes would only mix in those regions, and they could evolve to become different species. And that would be sympatric speciation because they're evolving to become different species, but while living in the same geographic area. So that's the main difference between sympatric and allopatric speciation. Now, our last little topic of discussion, which will go faster, is our postzygotic barriers. So let's say mating does happen and a zygote does form. How come we don't have the groups hybridizing and blending to become one species? So our first so in postzygotic barriers, they prevent hybrids from developing into viable fertile offspring. Okay, so let's go ahead and see. Our first one is reduced hybrid viability. So basically, mating happens, a zygote forms, but the genetics of the two parents are so different that there isn't like compatible DNA. There's not homologous genes, and therefore the genetic components in the zygote basically cause the zygote to not develop. And so you can imagine on farms, sheep and goats would be able to mechanically fit together and reproduce. However, you don't really see sheep-goat hybrids. And that's because their genetics are so different, it's not compatible. And then even though a zygote can form, it basically is like a miscarriage, like it doesn't develop. And then we have reduced hybrid fertility. So look at the difference in the names. Viability means it doesn't survive. A viable offspring means it survives and it's healthy and it's strong and can live, versus here, reduced hybrid fertility is the offspring is viable. So a really common example is a mule. So a horse and a donkey are two separate species. A donkey has 62 chromosomes and a horse has 64. When they mate and produce a mule is a great work animal because it has the characteristics of both a donkey and a horse, which make it fantastic for a lot of like farm labor and stuff. And so, but the mule has only 63 chromosomes. So if we see up here in this like egg right above my face, you can see it's missing a homologous pair. And so this odd number of chromosomes makes the mule sterile. And therefore, the offspring is viable, but it's not fertile. And therefore, you don't have horses and donkeys hybridizing and forming becoming the same species. They remain two separate species, but occasionally can produce a hybrid offspring, but that hybrid and a hybrid cannot mate. Okay, and then our last postzygotic barrier and our last slide today, I don't have any pictures or examples, but it's called hybrid breakdown. So this is basically where you have two different species mate. And then the F1 hybrids are viable and fertile. Now, the trick is, though, when an F1 hybrid and another F1 hybrid mate, the F2 are not viable or fertile. And then it begins to break down. That's where the name hybrid breakdown comes from. So let's take an example that I'm not sure of. So in the wild, they're finding actually that polar bears and grizzly bears have started to mate with climate change and their environments and ecosystems and habitats changing. They're like moving into new areas and new territories. So polar bears and grizzly bears are mating and having offspring. They're called like growlers or Prisleys. So let's pretend this F1 hybrid of a polar grizzly bear mates with another hybrid. Okay, so let's pretend they're viable and they're fertile. And they mate, but then the F2 generation doesn't develop. That's what hybrid breakdown would be. The only example that I'm aware of is one in rice plants, which wasn't very exciting to use as an example here. All right. So that's it on pre- and post-zygotic barriers, as well as allopatric and sympatric speciation. So great job.